Hello, I'm Jay Hirsch, Director of Administration of Columbia's ERM program. I'd like to invite you to today's panel on the REvil Ransomware supply chain attack. I'd like to tell you about some of our upcoming events. In the summer, we have 2 more coding for ERM seminars and 2 more IQRM seminars. Both of those seminars will repeat in the fall. On September 14th, we have our featured alumni panel. September 16th is the first of our fall mindfulness seminars, and you can register for that right now. And on September 21, we have our CRO Spotlight with Philip Sherrill of Arkansas Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And now I'd like to introduce today's panelists. First is Andre Krahel. He's an ERM lecturer and CEO and founder of LifeRs. And Sharyar Shagahi, he's an ERM lecturer and chief technology officer of Quantum Exchange. Gentlemen.
Thank you for having us tonight. And we would like to talk today about REvil and supply chain attacks. And I'm very pleased that Sharyar Shagahi joined me and will be moderating the discussions and also provide valuable input in our conversation.
Everybody, thanks for joining. So the agenda for today is, discussing the actual breach and then talking about different types of attack methods that specifically was applied towards this particular breach. We'll try to break it down into some components as it relates to the attack life cycle. And then there are some supplementary notes from a best practices perspective that we would like to share with you, some guidelines from FBI, and also some countermeasures from Kaseya advisory. And then ultimately we'll have a few minutes at the end of the presentation for Q&A. If you would, as Jay pointed out, post your questions and we'll try to address them at the end. So with that said, I'll give you a little high-level overview of what you see on the screen right now. So on Friday, July 2nd, 2021, not too long ago, there was an attack launch on MSP providers. MSP, as you know, are managed service providers that many organizations are using. So they have, hundreds of clients that they provide various types of services, managed services, from security services to IT services. Now, obviously, as a result of this type of an attack, more than 1 million systems were infected. And anyone that wanted to basically negotiate about a universal decryptor, which is, how do I address all of the impacted systems? It was a pretty high price, as you can see, over 70 million Bitcoins, which is, a cryptocurrency that is widely used in these types of attacks. And then, of course, there was a price tag associated with each individual decryption at an endpoint meaning that one of the clients of one of those MSPs, if they wanted to get access to the decryptor, they would pay close to $45,000 US. And as you can see on the right-hand side, this is a typical sort of a notification that you get when you get a ransomware attack. They give you a specific dates on the calendar. They basically give you some instructions, and you can see that in this particular situation, they referring to XMR, which is a Monero coin. This type of digital currency or cryptocurrency is a decentralized cryptocurrency that any observer cannot decipher addresses that are trading the transactions, the amounts, the addresses, or balances, or any kind of a transaction history. So it's totally anonymous. And as you know, this is a method of collecting financial gains as a result of these types of breaches. So, this presentation is more or less like a conversational. So I want to just pause here and see if Andre has anything else to add to what I just said.
Sure, you really pointed out a good example that Monero was used, and we've seen nation-state groups like, for example, Lazarus, who, for example, attacked Sony Pictures and Entertainment using the same conversion from a Bitcoin to Monero. And that's I would say, a shift in ransomware that we've seen over the last 2 years, that Bitcoin became a little bit more traceable. I would say on and around 80% of the coins are right now attributed to criminal type of activities, especially in cryptocurrency wallets, what we call the wallets, attributed to various threat actors. Also, maybe one picture to point out on the top is actually Kaseya tagging for. When you see on the top the happy block, that's the actually group REvil, and that's the message they posted. Like, they don't even hiding we are attacking the Kaseya, and we get into it why Kaseya became a target and how it relates to third-party liability. But ultimately, it was very calculated attack. We've got the first victim calling on and around noon on Friday, and this was a 3 days weekend, so long weekend in the United States, right? So you're looking at the very calculated attack over the long weekend.
Yeah, so you can see exactly based on some of the specific activities we talked about. Kaseya, basically was used as a way of, supply chain risk. As you know, supply chain risk refers to third-party risk. So you can basically tighten up your belt around all the required controls when it comes to cybersecurity mitigation program. But unfortunately, the extended enterprise, including some of these cloud-based solutions, are now the weakest link at times. And in this case, obviously, REvil Ransomware gang targeted Kaseya, which ultimately impacted thousands of customers that were serviced through these MSPs. So there were reported about 1,500 businesses that were obviously impacted as a result of this. And I mentioned earlier that the price was not cheap in terms of getting what was basically encrypted, which we'll talk about, decrypted, and that basically is shutting down the business at times. Huge operational impact, as you can imagine.
And maybe importantly, it's also add here to share your point is that Kaseya BSA solution is a very prominent cloud solution for mid-sized businesses. So basically, imagine that solution serves the MSP, the service provider, and then from service providers, you will have the clients of that provider. So it's a very calculated move on the REvil group and a threat actor itself, because they see the chain, how that basically things, and now they're tapping into multiple sources for the payments. So it's nicely calculated on their side.
So let's talk a little bit about the actual attack method and the vector that basically from a compromise perspective. So obviously, as you can see here, the internet facing Kaseya VSA servers were targeted by this attack. So this Kaseya, which is an on-prem solution, as we mentioned, that is used by a variety of MSPs, the way that it operates is unfortunately have insufficient separation between client environments. So if I'm an MSP and I'm serving 100 clients, it doesn't have a separation between those clients where you can actually isolate and basically maybe subnet your infrastructure to the point that you can actually manage clients based on a risk perspective differently. And that's one of the ways that these guys were able to exploit and leverage these types of techniques, including authentication bypass, arbitrary file upload, or code or command injection. So if you want to add a little color, Andre, in terms of this particular attack method.
So if we look at that exploit, and we highlighted some of the migrate type of framework, is something what we call the chain technique. meaning that it's not just a single exploitation of potential vulnerability. These are military type of strategies. We also often call them direct cyber actions, meaning that they chain the command. So no need an authentication, can upload any file to the target, then ran any command on the target. So this is almost like a military practice. So it takes a significant time to actually create such an exploit that can compromise that system. So it's not believed that the exploit was just simply created. We'll get into the conversation. It seems to be that it actually leaked from almost like a repository of certain agency that would have such exploits actually available. Also, threat actors and REvil were very skilled in clearing logs after the attack. So they went right into the system and deleted just literally just few lines. We are truly talking just few lines of a code that actually needed to be deleted. So it's nothing really substantial on heavy on their side to actually clear it. And I cannot say more about what the Sharia pointed out. One of the major weaknesses of the software was truly that when they designed the software, there was no separation, right? And then they didn't think about it that these clients actually would have to live in some type of isolation on the platform.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we cover as part of our ERM program, security by design. And that is exactly an example of where when they developed this software and pushed it out to these MSPs, they didn't think about security by design. Otherwise, they would have been able to kind of segment it. And one of the things that, and I know, if they were not announcing who they are, basically from a standpoint of this type of, this particular example, when they were able to clear the logs, from a forensics perspective, Andre, would that have been a difficult situation to be able to understand who did the job?
Oh, definitely, and Sharia, there were multiple IP addresses sources used. So threat actors literally use different IP addresses or different sources for exploitations of the system, and then different IP addresses for actually accessing the system. So they ran it from multiple sources just to cover as much possible the track and also the traces where they are coming from. And the original IP addresses, you're right on a point here that the addresses from which actually attack happens, so from those almost like a hidden shelters on the internet, they try to clear those. They were not masking as much the IP addresses for the deployment of ransomware. They were literally coming from out of the Amazon cloud.
So there are some links in here in case you wanted to kind of get additional information more than what we're going to be able to cover in less than an hour. But based on what happened with this particular ransomware attack, and some of the highlights or 7 deadly sins of the future ransomware attacks footprint is listed that we wanted to kind of cover from a standpoint of characteristics. As Andre pointed out, this was a chained exploit, obviously have much higher impact in terms of number of endpoints. And of course, based on the individual group that initiated this attack, they're very much of a nation state and military style type of attack. To that extent, the group continues to be well funded from a variety of previous ransomware activities. And if they're nation state, sometimes the adversary nations would also contribute to that involvement. The Russian government will not control the usage and leakage of cyber weapons and intelligence used for criminal activities. They will continue pretending that this is not happening. And this is something that you've seen across all different types of breaches that are sort of nation state cross-border. Most governments are denying the fact that they're supporting these types of organizations.
And if you also look at the point too, especially the ransomware groups, like we actually do know 2 individuals behind this cyber attack in a group. And I can tell you that they started career as a basic programmers, moving up to the ladder and now becoming more in a command and control. We also see the investment ecosystem, meaning that it's almost like a Silicon Valley. These groups are created for a period of 2 to 4 years, meaning they're already funded with the fraudulent Bitcoins. And why Bitcoins? Because some of those coins are now hard to cash. It's hard to move a fraudulent wallet that's already being discussed and already being known to actually an exchange and cash funds from it. So some of the groups do have a hard time to actually get cash out of it, and they basically funding a new operating activities for new ransomware groups. It's enough that the government literally just closes the eye when individuals take a USB with some of those exploits. And when we're looking at a style of exploit, is perhaps not exactly SVR type in terms of the coding, but ultimately maybe just someone said, look, here's exploit, but don't use the whole code. Just you have to modify a little bit so it doesn't look like this weapon came from this shop. And I would also say that another trend, Sharia, what we've seen is that some of these ex-military operators of these agencies are truly just right now finding retirement in this, meaning that they are the cyber weapon. They know exactly how to conduct these cyber military missions. And it's truly unequal to an enterprise doing deal with it. Imagine 2 jets flying over your house and shooting 2 Tomahawk rockets. I mean, it's not much probably normal enterprise can actually do.
Exactly. And, to that extent, there is always a lot of data exchange between government entities and agencies and private sector due to the nature of the beast. We live in a very integrated environment. And in recent, months, because of escalated attacks, obviously ransomware is one of the most common ones, but there has been targeting a lot of critical infrastructure, utility and power, which, as a result of these successful attacks, the organizations at the federal level have started to escalate the need for collaboration between government agencies and private sector. We've always had these shared information platforms that started with banking post 9/11 because of a lot of terrorist financing and creation of Patriot Act, which created the whole KYC AML requirements to financial institutions. And then, of course, highly regulated industries have always been kind of moving in that direction. But now this whole collaboration between government and private sector is a big noise in the marketplace. So one thing you see from a standpoint of other observations, third-party liabilities is one of the reasons that these types of high-paying ransomware targets are selected. As Andre can point out, based on all of the work that he does in this space, the bad guys have access to a lot of organizations' insurance coverage and policies, and be able to really know where is a good place to throw your net and be able to collect as much money as possible because of those types of coverages. The cyber insurance has been a pretty much of a interesting area, very busy area. And, I've been involved with working with some of these insurance organizations where they are trying to enhance the way they evaluate the coverages and policies that they can issue to organizations using a risk-based approach. Obviously, unlike P&C, property and casualty types of policies, where the science of actuarial sciences is the parameter for them to be able to come up with, what's their loss and coverage and variety of attributes related to that policy. With cyber coverage, is kind of interesting because it's not, actuarial sciences doesn't work in cyber. what you need to do is apply a variety of models to be able to come up with, how you measure ultimately the, probability of, occurrence and what's the percentage of impact to the value to the organizations. And these are all derived from how mature are different layers of control in your organization. And so although this has been around for a number of years, but I still think that this is still a playing ground for a lot of organizations to kind of figure out how to provide various types of evidences that they have built resilient in their environment so that they can get better premiums from the insurance coverages. But as you'll hear from Andre, which he deals with this type of situation on a daily basis, that's really one source of data for these bad guys to go after. They don't just go and say, let's go after, 500 organizations of this particular industry. They do their homework up front to be able to know that, these target organizations would end up paying part of that payment through their insurance coverage.
Sure, right on the point. And if you look at the Colonial, for example, compromise, it's a third-party liability data exposure, basically doing something what we call a publication. And we'll get into that at the bottom with a commercial general liability reasoning of the Fifth Circuit decision on this issue, where that plays a significant role. The company might be able to restore and might be able to recover, but a third-party liability, the disclosure of information, disclosures of third-party data. In insurance, we have something what we call the first-party disclosure and third-party disclosure. First parties are basically related, let's say, directly to employees, and a third party to all your third parties you work with. And it might be actually a substantial amount of information that these companies do have and possess, and might not be able to contractually even disclose or be publicly available. Threat actors like REvil, they created their own site in the network, what we call Tor, and they post the data, and they post a line and which basically has a counter how many days that entity has to negotiate a ransom until the data is publicly available. So they can be truly substantial, 10 times more even what the ransom actually is. And as Sharia pointed out, insurance premiums and umbrella coverages, meaning the limits, are pretty much known to these groups. And they usually got the data from various marketing efforts, various spreadsheets, and competitive analysis. It's not very uncommon to know what the actual insurance premiums are at these enterprises. Another important fact in here is that federal enforcement is tracking on the laundering the cryptocurrency as from these fraudulent wallets. There was a conference in The Hague where almost 300 members came in, but still there's no international cooperation. Basically, the same that perhaps exists in banking does not actually apply to cryptocurrency exchanges. So if too many right now cryptocurrency exchanges in a countries where it's much easier to actually launder money into it. And while you might be talking maybe only up to $3-5 million, still on an annual basis, that's substantial cash for the criminals to actually conduct their activities and maybe keep the rest of it in the pocket. And as was pointed out in here, the risk transfer is not something that is more acceptable anymore. Like you have a technical error and omissions, ransom and kidnapping coverages, commercial general liability. But the main challenge is that since, as Sharia said, these insurance coverages, the limits are already disclosed, it's basically the risk transfer would not work for the ERM. You kind of have to calculate that what you already have is being actually disclosed to the trade actors, and you will need to deal with the situation. What we've seen is that many of the enterprises actually select their own counsel and their own firm to actually deal with the coverage in supplement with the insurance carrier. The last one I want to point out in here, and Sharia, this was very interesting, I love the legal world, is the commercial general liability and the recent Fifth Circuit decision on a treatment of publication. And while the federal court denied the plaintiff claim, then the carrier had a duty to defend its insurance under coverage B, what we call the coverage B, personal and advertising injury, and then commercial general liability policy for a claim arising out of that data breach, that the data would be actually available. So that was actually a very interesting decision from a Fifth Circuit court. And what happened was actually that many of the carriers took the approach where they made an exclusion to the publication and to that personal and advertising injury, right? So now when we go back to the insurance policies, is that there will be most likely than not some of the exclusions that are coming in based on these factual court decisions that I've actually seen from real data breaches.
Yeah, and in certain industries like financial services that are highly regulated, the risk transfer, like going from transferring your risk, residual risk to a third party. Regulators look at you to owning the risk end to end. That's why there's so many different supply chain risk requirements and regulations that has been escalated at the federal and state level, that basically is enforcing these organizations like these banks, that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, if the third party fails, you have failed. So that's kind of one thing. But when it comes to insurance coverage, with all the things that Andre, you pointed out, from your experience, knowing that at the end of the day, when I'm attacked, I have coverage, so I'd rather pay. And of course, we know that guidelines from the government, including FBI, is that don't pay because you set bad examples. But at the end of the day, even FBI points out that, at the end of the day, it's your business decision, because obviously there are situations like in the case of hospitals, we know that there's a life and death situation if they're, encrypting clinical data, as an example. But from your experience, what percentage of these types of ransomware attacks they actually pay and move on versus negotiate and kind of, try to restore?
Sure, it's a really great question. And when you look at a third-party liability game where data information is being posted, the payments are really high. We're looking maybe close to 90%, right? Because that's just the third-party liability trigger is really, really the area that companies cannot avoid, and a legal ramification or anticipation of litigation for such entities is not something that a general counsel or outside counsel would actually get involved to. And that's what we've seen in Kaseya too, is that basically because of the third-party force, they purchased the general decryptor for everyone, because that was ultimately the right thing to do, rather than having the individual victims go through it. And a victim, for example, that we had, there was a hospital with 500 beds in Connecticut, few police stations, few fire stations. So basically, like in a Kaseya, it's almost, you can think that, well, they probably would not want to pay, but how they cannot pay when now they're being basically responsible, and their insurance coverage is at the state. Like, so they need to do the right thing, and the right thing for them is to basically help all these entities that were using their software, and their software is now the vehicle that delivers that code. So they, because of the third-party liability that they have to the customer of the MSPs, so you have a Kaseya MSP providers, and then you have the end customers, basically, the third-party liability that Waterfall forces them to pay. And threat actors like REvil are very legally skilled, or they have good and clear understanding of why that company would pay. And we've just seen it here, like, literally nicely unfold attack by REvil group, and they were just basically waiting to get paid, and they knew they're gonna get paid.
I think there is a question already out there in terms of, what malicious payload was applied for this particular attack. So it's actually right here. Obviously, most of these attacks are through delivery of malicious update payload to your internet accessible sort of servers, and ultimately that, a payload is targeting through a variety of platforms, kind of coming in, we call it north-south, and then, they can basically compromise various platforms, east-west, and they leverage some sort of a zero day, as you know, is a defect, typically in some sort of a system or software that has not been patched. So by the time, the vendor Microsoft identifies a vulnerability that needs to be addressed, by the time that vulnerability is, a fix to that vulnerability is deployed and developed and deployed, tested and deployed, that time frame between that time frame, the bad guys identify that as your weak point to get in. They call it 0 day, right? So that's kind of how the initial access happened in this situation. And if you want to take it from here in terms of the actual kind of dropping the base 64 encoded file to Kaseya's working directory, anything you want to add to that?
If you're looking in here, that 0 day we already described, and that's the authentication challenge that Kaseya software has, that the file upload and the command and control, right? So these bypassing the authentication, uploading the file, the chain exploit is basically what's leverage here. And again, it's a question that was found at the SVR or somewhere else, and what agency actually contributed to that exploit. One important maybe point out in here, that ultimately the agents, that piece of software called Kaseya actually runs these agents on endpoints, right? So if you drop something on a main server, it automatically propagates. This is no different as a water pipeline in your building. Someone drops something in a tank, everyone gets it. And these agents are configured to check with the main server in a period for a new upload, for a new download. And in the case of Kaseya, if you look at this piece of code, there was a piece of code, what we call the base 64 encoded, that basically was dropped into this working directory. Kaseya itself actually provided a manual to exclude these directories from any protection, just because they were deploying the upgrades to those directories, and they did not want security software to intervene. So maybe sounds a little bit strange, but people who misconfigure the installation guideline of Kaseya actually were safe from this cyber attack. And also, if someone uses like a little bit more sophisticated software than the others, they'll also spare from this type of attack. In a third sequence here, we see something, let's say, might be more unique. One, that piece of code is decoded, is actually disable intrusion prevention system. If you look at the line, it says disable intrusion prevention system true. So it's basically disabling protection, natively built protections in Microsoft operating system. Is also disabling antivirus of Windows, Microsoft Windows Defender, also control folder access, network protection, and submit sample consent, which means that if there's some kind of malware found, it will be actually submitted to Microsoft. So they're disabling all the component into it. And what you see at the end is basically something what we call the decode process or deflating process, and then basically deletion of that file that it actually came from.
Yep, it's, as you can see, it's basically bringing down your lines of defense.
Yeah. And it's truly done with the scripting, Sharia, of the native operating system. And this is what we've seen from these more sophisticated groups. They don't really reinvent the wheel. What they're trying to do is they're trying to mimic like behavior of the administration in a system. Someone who would be truly a network admin, just writing the commands and executing these commands on the systems. So they try to stay undercover as much as possible.
And in this situation, they also, impaired Windows Defender, which obviously has characteristics associated with network protection and variety of ways that your system, your Windows operating system is trying to detect and block these types of breaches by being able to really exploit through a variety of, bringing down your defense and then scanning through all of your downloaded files and attachments and and ultimately applying some method of encryption to it.
Yeah, and this is a very important piece for them, right? So basically disable whatever is in there, don't interfere, which also help them to speed up the encryption of the systems. Because once the antivirus software, Microsoft Defender, is not running, the Windows Defender is not actually active. The Defender has a feature where it basically scans every action on the system, is questioning the actions on the system. Once they disable any questioning, basically it helps them to also speed up the momentum of the encryption for that specific enterprise system. Yeah, and this one, Sharia, is something called Sodinokibi.exe. It's kind of like there's no special magic into it. It's just one of like basically built-in executables in a system itself. But lately has been really used by threat actors to copy and basically deploy the code. So that's why it's actually being in here. And again, this goes back to what we call technique, tactics, and procedures by this by the threat actor. And it's been this truly living of the land tool that's helped the threat actors to propagate the ransomware through the organization. This is just the example of the decoding of that agent.crt to agent.exe. And again, this is a common technique to use for executables to basically being hidden before actually get what we call a deflated or decoded on a system. And it's very simple trick, and often avoids that basically the initial detection or initial scanning of that system. Because as you recall, it's important for them to disable any of those components, right? And then basically for the threat actor to work in that mode where the Windows Defender is not actually working properly on the system, and it's being disabled on that enterprise system.
And as we learned earlier, we talked about cleaning the tracks, removing the encoded payload and temporary copy of your executable, basically leaving no trace behind, so that they can basically apply the same method in other future attacks.
And this is common. I mean, the threat actor usually they truly love that the cleaning part of it, right? Like they always try to mimic as much as possible.
Yeah, and then of course, going through this process, they come in with a valid authentication, signed in with a certificate that obviously is unknown how the threat actor acquired the key required to sign this executable, which ultimately this is when the file agent is dropped, and then the actual code would scan through your targeted environments, directory systems, file shares, and start to apply the encryption against that particular target environment.
And so here maybe, Shara, it's important to know that what's actually loading a malware is Microsoft Defender, the executable. And this is executable, if I'm not mistaken, from maybe 2014 and 2015, which has what we call vulnerable to DLL side loading and injection. So it's a very specific type of injections of the DLL right into that executable. So basically threat actors not leveraging some kind of code that they would create, they're actually using Microsoft code and Microsoft Defender, the tool it's antivirus itself. And we've seen also the same with the various nation state threat actors using actually security software for loading the malicious code. So this is important to note here that the threat actor truly leveraging this mpsvc.dll, which is ultimately the encryption, the ransomware into it through Microsoft Defender. And it has the same signature as you, Shara, pointed out, of the PB03 Transport Ltd. One of the reasons that threat actors do that is that often unsigned programs are not able to run on the operating system itself.
Yeah, and you can see that the encryptor that they started, it modifies different components of your infrastructure, including firewalls, any kind of network devices, and ultimately local drives, and even removable drives that are all mapped to your network drives.
And one more component to maybe add here, Sharia, is that this was very quick. encryption, just because that program for scanning is truly designed to be what we call the multi-threaded, right? So it'll have like a really high performance. This was also very quickly done in terms of the encrypting the systems itself.
And you can see that, significant level of automation as a result of this, not too much of manual punching into the attack, as well as the fact that, a lot of, not being malware doesn't delete the volume shadow copies. The same thing with, encryption process is multi-threaded and extremely fast. So you can see that, basically once they're in there, they can do the damage very quickly.
An important piece in here is that, if you go to that slide, was that there was no data exfiltration, right? So basically the threat actor here, it's not trying to exfiltrate the data from this organization. They truly just play that third-party card, and third-party card plays really well for them in this. And also, Shari, if something very specific, what we call volume shadow copies, and right now they don't even care anymore to delete this, right? It's something that you could actually go and recover, but it's a very slow recovery for these victims, and they know that a Kaseya most likely than not will pay, because it's ultimately not feasible way for these companies to actually recover.
So there are some guidelines, just to be cautious of time here. We have close to 17 minutes. So from a standpoint of FBI guidance for MSPs and their customers, specifically that were affected by Kaseya VSA supply chain ransomware attack, there are some downloadable Kaseya VSA detection tool that, and this type of tool analyzes the system, determines whether any indicators of compromise are present. There are also other recommendations like, enforcing multi-factor authentication on every single account that is under the control of the organization, and enabling and enforcing multi-factor for customer-facing services. Obviously, having second layer of securities, supports the concept of defense in depth. Implementing and allowing, certain type of whitelisting to limit the communication in terms of, remote monitoring and management of, various known IP addresses that you would be able to block off. Placing some administrative interfaces of RMM behind the virtual private network, the VPN, that ultimately incorporating VPN or a firewall on dedicated administrative network. Again, this is focusing on a subnet of your network that you're trying to ultra protect. As with every other types of ransomware, making sure your backups are up to date and is stored in something that you can actually bring it and restore your information. Make sure, because a lot of these types of ransomware attacks, they also not only encrypt your data on your primary servers, they actually have a way to encrypt your backups. So that's something that you need to watch out for in terms of ransomware restore if you go through that process. And of course, anything that has to do with manual patch management process, because in this situation, since you've turned off certain components of your infrastructure, including bringing down or isolating your servers, you ought to be able to have a process in place to be able to actually do install of some of the new patches, in a manual basis.
And ultimately, Shari, also, if you look at the advisory, anyone should really be aware that threat actors like REvil, they are able to read the manuals. And if manual says exclude some folders, do something with this. So I think one of the new norms also is do not follow the complete standards of the manuals, especially if you're deploying third-party software. Don't deploy it exactly the way, makes your own tweaks into the deployment. And the companies who have done it, like for example, that Connecticut provider, that MSP provider, only 20% of his customers got encrypted, only 20%. So not everyone was encrypted. I would say more than half of them did not encrypt it because it was improperly configured, right? So that you don't want to do that too, but in this case, it's that improper configuration really truly saved them from not being encrypted. But ultimately, the systems had different issues than ransomware in it.
So in a way, they unintentionally hardened their acquired software.
Exactly. They created a hardening process by not doing the things right.
Exactly.
They could be hit by something else, right? Like you never know. It's just this one did not apply to them, but something else could be really catastrophic for them.
Exactly. And you can see again, typically when you're in a situation like that, you want to isolate the problem and don't let it bleed into the rest of your environment. So, on-premise BSA servers should continue to remain offline until further instruction from Kaseya about when it's safe to restore the operations, and a patch, of course, would be required to install prior to restarting the servers, and some of the recommendations as it relates to your security posture. Customers who experienced ransomware and receive communication from attackers should not click on any links, and they may be weaponized, those types of links.
And if you look at the last one, like the IOCs, what we call the indicators of compromise. So we look at the initial system that we know of, initial vector that we know of, and also the IOC. So the hashes of the executables, IP addresses, Sharia, what you mentioned before, that perhaps the threat actor came from. Also the communication back and forth of the threat actor, the domains that have been affiliated with this specific intrusion. They're actually all available on a GitHub. And I tell you, it's not very common, but this time the community really came together. I'm sure many of these were subject of the FBI grand jury subpoena, but the community really came together and published most of the information for victims, truly just to help them. It was a massive attack that was on a Friday before the long weekend. So it was something that truly would not need to be addressed.
And there's some, again, guiding principles related to, what we've covered as it relates to making sure that, you're taking the right steps. I think we've covered some of them, including verifying your offline backups, or especially for critical servers. Everything, again, as we talked about, is risk-based, right? So it's not a white paintbrush approach. You need to isolate where your critical servers and applications and data that needs to be ultra protected, and applying various set of controls, including network segmentation in different zones, and making sure that from a standpoint of access to your network, you're mapping your drives appropriately. And of course, check your incident response team, make sure that they're ready to respond to a situation through various types of tabletop testing, as well as, continuously evolve your incident response plans, because those are the things that, as Andre pointed out, the threats are continuing to increase, and the level of attacks from a sophistication perspective is getting more and more in a way that, if you had a plan from a year ago, it's not valid anymore. You need to constantly evolve it.
And also one thing to point out in here is the containment, eradication, isolation, as you mentioned, Sharia, is truly the key, right? So how that security code will contain it, how the malware will be eradicated, and then how to protect the lateral movement through the isolation of these hosts is crucial. And what you saw on the script is the threat actors, Windows Defender, Microsoft Windows Defender serves that function. So threat actors went right into it and try to disable, and they were successful to completely disable and disarm that system. So basically, there was no barrier for them to propagate laterally through the whole organization and do a massive encryption of the systems in very short period of time. And one more important is also these network shares that were mentioned here, that often the network share, the map shares are shared to the resources. And sometimes there's no good reasons to enable read and write access. So if the person is only downloading files, let them have only read access. There's no reason for that person to actually write anything into it. We'll have directories where they write to what we call the transfer directories, and from transfer directories, we then upload it to the main storages. And in many organizations, it's not happening the same way. It's a read and write access. That's, for example, what happened at the Colonials. There was no reason why accounting computer would ever write any data to a pipeline. It's a common mistake. So have the separation of what that level of the access is at the system turned to be crucial.
Yeah, and that's very, very much common in a lot of industries and organizations. Unfortunately, you know, what Andre just pointed out is identity and access management, RBAC, privileged access. These are the things that, you know, you really need to start looking at provisioning individuals and systems, not just individuals, to the proper analysis of, you know, the role itself and the level of, you know, least privilege access for them to be able to perform their function. And most organizations, due to, you know, lack of automation, volume, and variety of reasons, they haven't been able to do a good job really tightening up those set of controls. And that's pretty much it. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great evening or great day, and looking forward for the next session. Bye-bye.
Thank you really for having us.